Margaret Sullivan woke up at exactly 6 o'clock a.m., just like she did every morning. At 62 years old, she had been the HOA president of Willow Creek Estates for nearly 10 years. Her routine was as precise as a Swiss watch. After her morning coffee and a quick scan of the community message board, she grabbed her clipboard and began her daily patrol. The residents of Willow Creek Estates had mixed feelings about Margaret. Some appreciated her dedication to keeping the neighborhood pristine, while others found her methods a bit extreme. She had earned herself quite a reputation for her strict enforcement of every rule, no matter how small. That particular Monday morning, the sun was just beginning to peek over the rooftops as Margaret started her rounds. She walked with purpose, her sensible shoes clicking against the pavement. Her eagle eyes scanned every front yard, checking for any violations, grass too long, trash cans left out past collection day, or unauthorized decorations. As she turned onto Maple Drive, something caught her attention. There, in the visitor parking area, sat a car she had never seen before. It was a sleek, matte black Dodge Charger that looked like it had just rolled off a movie set. The car was impressive, powerful looking, and completely out of place in their quiet suburban community. Margaret approached the vehicle, her clipboard ready. The first thing she noticed was that the car was parked slightly over the yellow line, a clear violation of HOA Parking Regulation 12.34. She circled the vehicle, taking notes. No visitor pass was displayed in the windshield, another violation. The car had some unusual features that might have given another person pause. There were what appeared to be government license plates on both ends. The vehicle had hidden strobe lights tucked behind the grille and in the rear window. A cluster of radio antennas sprouted from the trunk, but Margaret was focused on one thing only: the parking violations. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Metro Towing Services. They were always quick to respond to her calls, and she had their number on speed dial. As she waited for them to answer, she noticed Mrs. Thompson, her neighbor from across the street, watching from her front porch. "Good morning, Margaret," Mrs. Thompson called out. "Quite a fancy car, isn't it?" Margaret nodded curtly. "It's in violation, no visitor pass, and it's over the line." Mrs. Thompson started to say something else, but Margaret was already talking to the towing company. "Yes, this is Margaret Sullivan from Willow Creek Estates. I need a vehicle removed immediately. Visitor parking area on Maple Drive. Black Dodge Charger. Multiple violations." As she hung up, she felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. Rules were rules, and they existed for a reason. If she let one person get away with breaking them, soon everyone would think they could do whatever they wanted. The community would descend into chaos. 20 minutes later, Jake from Metro Towing arrived with his flatbed truck. He was a young man who had responded to many of Margaret's calls over the years. As he began the process of loading the car, more neighbors started to gather, curious about the commotion. "Margaret, are you sure about this?" asked Mr. Peterson from next door. "That looks like some kind of official vehicle." Margaret waved away his concern. If it was official, they would have followed proper procedure and obtained a visitor pass. Besides, it's parked improperly. As the tow truck lifted the gleaming black car onto its bed, Margaret couldn't help but feel vindicated. She had maintained order in Willow Creek Estates once again. The rules apply to everyone, no matter how fancy their car might be. Little did she know that this particular Monday morning would become the most memorable day of her HOA presidency. The mysterious black car would soon reveal secrets that would turn her orderly world upside down and teach her lessons she never expected to learn. As the tow truck disappeared around the corner, Margaret made a note in her logbook about the incident. She felt satisfied with another job well done. The mysterious black car was now someone else's problem, and Willow Creek Estates could return to its peaceful, orderly state. But something about that car lingered in her mind. It wasn't like the usual vehicles she dealt with, beat-up sedans belonging to overnight guests or work trucks that overstayed their welcome. This car had an aura of importance, though Margaret quickly pushed that thought aside. Rules were rules, after all. Mrs. Thompson approached Margaret as she was finishing her notes. "You know, I saw some people with cameras and equipment around here earlier this morning," she said carefully. "They were wearing those vests that film crews wear." Margaret looked up from her clipboard, slightly annoyed. "Film crews? Here." I certainly wasn't notified of any such activity. Well, they were just down the street, Mrs. Thompson continued. I heard them mention something about a big movie production. That car might have been connected to them. Margaret waved her hand dismissively. If there was any official filming happening in our community, they would have gone through proper channels. They would have contacted the HOA board, obtained permits, and certainly wouldn't have parked illegally. She continued her patrol, but Mrs. Thompson's words nagged at her. Film crews? In Willow Creek Estates? The idea seemed absurd. Their quiet suburban neighborhood was hardly Hollywood material. As she walked, more residents stopped to ask about the towed car. Word spread quickly in their small community, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. That was quite a car, said Mr. Rodriguez, who was watering his perfectly manicured lawn. Looked expensive. Are you sure it was just some random visitor? The expense of a vehicle doesn't exempt it from our regulations, Margaret replied firmly. If anything, owners of expensive cars should be more careful about following rules. By mid-morning, Margaret had fielded at least a dozen questions about the black Charger. Each time she gave the same response. Rules must be followed, no exceptions. She was beginning to feel like a broken record. Around 11 o'clock a.m., Margaret returned to her house to update the HOA violation database. As she typed in the details of the morning's incident, she noticed something odd about the license plate number she had recorded. The format was different from standard state plates. It had a special prefix she didn't recognize. For the first time that day, a small seed of doubt crept into her mind. She had been so focused on the parking violations that she hadn't paid much attention to the vehicle's other details. Those hidden lights, the antennas, the unusual plates, they all suggested this wasn't just any car. Margaret shook her head, pushing the doubt away. She had been doing this job for 10 years. She knew what she was doing. If the car's owner wanted it back, they could pay the towing fee and the HOA fine like everyone else. She finished entering the data and decided to take a break. As she made herself a cup of tea, she glanced out her kitchen window. The visitor parking area looked empty and orderly now, just the way she liked it. But the peace wouldn't last long. In just a few hours, Margaret's carefully ordered world would be turned upside down. The black Charger she had so confidently towed away was about to bring more attention to Willow Creek Estates than the community had ever experienced. As she sipped her tea, completely unaware of the storm brewing, Margaret felt content. She had done her duty as HOA president. She had maintained order and enforced the rules. Little did she know that this particular enforcement would become the most talked about incident in the history of Willow Creek Estates, and that the mysterious black car would soon reveal connections that would shock everyone, especially Margaret herself. The afternoon sun was high in the sky when Jake from Metro Towing called Margaret back. She had saved his number in her phone, and seeing his name appear on her screen wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the nervous tone in his voice. "Mrs. Sullivan," Jake began hesitantly, "about that black Charger we towed this morning." "Yes? Is there a problem with the paperwork?" Margaret asked, already reaching for her pen. "Well, not exactly. You see, when we got to the impound lot, my boss took one look at the car and nearly had a heart attack. He says we need to talk to you right away." Margaret frowned. "I don't understand. It was parked illegally. The tow was completely justified." "Ma'am, that car, it's not just any car. My boss recognized some of the equipment. He thinks it might be a police vehicle." Margaret's hand tightened on the phone. "A police vehicle? That's impossible. It had no markings, no visible identification." "That's the thing," Jake continued. "Some police cars are unmarked for special operations. This one has government plates and what looks like surveillance equipment. My boss is really worried." After hanging up, Margaret sat at her kitchen table, her mind racing. A police car? In her visitor parking lot? Without any notification? It didn't make sense. She had always been careful to maintain good relationships with local law enforcement. They had never had issues before. She decided to go back to the visitor parking area to look for any clues she might have missed. As she walked down the street, she noticed more neighbors outside than usual. Word had spread about the morning's incident, and people were curious. When she reached the spot where the black Charger had been parked, she found Mrs. Thompson talking to a group of residents. They all turned to look at her as she approached. Margaret, Mrs. Thompson said, I was just telling everyone about those film people I saw this morning. They were definitely here, setting up equipment down by the community center. Before Margaret could respond, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching. 3 cars turned onto their street, 2 regular sedans, and to Margaret's shock, another black Charger identical to the one she had towed. The cars pulled up near the group of residents, and several people got out. Margaret immediately noticed their professional appearance. Some wore suits, others had on casual clothes with official-looking badges. And then she saw him. A tall, muscular man stepped out of the second sedan. Even from a distance, Margaret recognized him. It was Vin Diesel, the famous actor. He was talking animatedly with someone who appeared to be a police officer. Margaret felt her stomach drop. The pieces were starting to fall into place, and she didn't like the picture they were forming. The group walked directly toward her. Vin Diesel was in the lead, but his expression wasn't angry. He looked more curious than anything else. "Excuse me," he said as he approached. "Are you the HOA president? We're looking for a car that was parked here this morning." Margaret swallowed hard. "Yes, I'm Margaret Sullivan, the HOA president. There was a vehicle parked illegally this morning. It was towed according to our community regulations." The police officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, that vehicle is police property. It was on loan to Mr. Diesel's production company for filming. We need to locate it immediately." Margaret felt her face grow hot. All around her, neighbors were gathering, phones out, recording the interaction. This was exactly the kind of attention she had always worked to avoid for their quiet community. I had no way of knowing," she stammered. "There was no permit, no visitor pass." Vin Diesel held up his hand. "It's okay," he said calmly. "Let's just figure out how to get the car back. We have filming scheduled for this afternoon, and that car is kind of important to the scene." As Margaret provided the towing company's information, she realized that her simple act of rule enforcement had just become a lot more complicated than she ever imagined. 2 hours had passed since Margaret made that fateful call to Metro Towing, and now her quiet neighborhood was buzzing with activity. News vans had started arriving, attracted by social media posts about Vin Diesel's presence in Willow Creek Estates. Margaret watched in dismay as her perfectly ordered community transformed into something resembling a movie premiere. The police officer, Lieutenant Barnes, was explaining the situation to Margaret and the gathering crowd. "The vehicle you had towed is a decommissioned police interceptor. We loaned it to the film production for authentic action sequences. It contains specialized camera equipment worth over $50,000. Margaret felt her knees go weak. $50,000? She had towed away $50,000 worth of equipment over a minor parking violation. Vin Diesel, surprisingly calm despite the situation, added more details. "We were filming a scene just a few blocks away. I stopped here briefly to visit my cousin Tony, who lives in Unit 23B. I was only going to be here for 15 minutes to drop off some family photos." Margaret's face burned with embarrassment. Tony from 23B. She knew him well. He was always prompt with his HOA dues and kept his yard immaculate. If only she had known. The film's production manager, a woman with a clipboard and a concerned expression, stepped forward. "We're already behind schedule, and every hour of delay costs the production thousands of dollars. We need that car back immediately." Lieutenant Barnes turned to Margaret. "Ma'am, we need to retrieve that vehicle as soon as possible. The equipment inside is not only valuable, but contains sensitive technology that shouldn't be in a public impound lot." Margaret fumbled with her phone, her hands shaking as she dialed Jake at Metro Towing. The call went straight to voicemail. She tried again with the same result. "They might be closed for lunch," she said weakly, aware of how inadequate that sounded given the circumstances. More residents had gathered now, forming a large circle around the group. Some were taking pictures, others were whispering among themselves. Margaret could hear fragments of their conversations. "I told her it looked official. She never listens. This is going to be all over the news." Vin Diesel's assistant was on her phone, speaking rapidly. "Yes, we need legal here right now. The car was towed." "No, it's police property." "Yes, camera equipment inside." Margaret felt like she was in a nightmare. In all her years as HOA president, she had never faced anything like this. She had always prided herself on keeping Willow Creek Estates out of the spotlight, maintaining its reputation as a quiet, well-run community. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was just trying to enforce our rules. I had no idea." Vin Diesel looked at her, and to her surprise, his expression softened. "Look, Mrs. Sullivan, I understand you were doing your job. But maybe this is a lesson about checking things out before taking action." Just then, Margaret's phone rang. It was Jake from Metro Towing. "Mrs. Sullivan? My boss wants to talk to you. We've got a situation here. The police are at our lot, and they're not happy." As Margaret explained the situation to the towing company, she could see news cameras being set up. Reporters were interviewing residents, and she could only imagine what they were saying about her. The HOA board members began arriving, summoned by frantic calls from neighbors. They looked at Margaret with a mixture of concern and disbelief. This incident was going to require an emergency meeting, insurance claims, and possibly legal consultation. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret realized that her simple decision to tow a car had created a perfect storm. She had inadvertently involved the police department, a major film production, a celebrity, and now the media. The quiet, orderly world she had worked so hard to maintain was crumbling around her, all because she hadn't taken a moment to look beyond her rulebook. The community center at Willow Creek Estates had never seen such a crowd. Every seat was filled, and people lined the walls as the emergency HOA board meeting got underway. Margaret sat at the head table, feeling smaller than she ever had in her life. Next to her were the other board members, all wearing grim expressions. The board's attorney, Mr. Davidson, stood up to address the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're facing a serious situation. The vehicle that was towed this morning was indeed police property on loan to a major film production. The potential legal ramifications are significant." He explained that the police department was considering charges for interfering with official equipment. The film production company had already calculated their losses, not just the towing fees, but the cost of delayed filming, crew overtime, and rescheduling. The numbers were staggering. "We're looking at potential damages in the range of $75,000, Mr. Davidson announced. A collective gasp went through the room. Margaret felt sick to her stomach. She had never intended for any of this to happen. All she wanted was to keep their community orderly and safe. In the back of the room, she could see Tony, Vin Diesel's cousin, sitting quietly. He had been nothing but gracious about the whole situation, but Margaret couldn't meet his eyes. The vice president of the HOA board, Mrs. Chen, spoke up. "Our insurance policy may not cover this type of incident. We've never had to deal with anything like this before." As the meeting continued, residents began voicing their opinions. Many were angry at Margaret for her overzealous enforcement. Others defended her, saying she couldn't have known the car's importance. "Maybe it's time we reviewed our towing policies," suggested Mr. Peterson. This whole thing could have been avoided with a simple phone call. Margaret finally found her voice. "I take full responsibility for my actions," she said, standing up. "I should have investigated further before calling the towing company. I let my dedication to the rules blind me to common sense." Just then, the door opened and Vin Diesel walked in, accompanied by his legal team and the film's producers. The room fell silent. "May I speak?" Vin Diesel asked. The board nodded. He walked to the front of the room. "I understand everyone's upset, and rightfully so. But I want to say something. Mrs. Sullivan here was doing what she thought was right for her community. Yes, it caused problems for us, but I don't believe she acted with malice." The film's producer, a tall woman in a business suit, stepped forward. "We've been discussing this situation, and we may have a solution that could benefit everyone involved." Margaret looked up, hope flickering in her chest for the first time since this ordeal began. The producer continued, "Instead of pursuing legal action, we're willing to work something out. We've actually been looking for authentic suburban locations for several scenes in our film." Vin Diesel nodded. "Your community is perfect for what we need. If the HOA agrees, we'd like to use Willow Creek Estates as a filming location. We'll compensate the community generously, enough to cover any damages from today's incident and then some." The room buzzed with excitement. This was an unexpected turn of events. Mr. Davidson quickly calculated the potential benefits. "This could actually be very lucrative for our community. Film productions typically pay substantial location fees. Margaret couldn't believe what she was hearing. Instead of facing financial ruin and legal troubles, they were being offered an opportunity. "There's one condition," Vin Diesel added, looking directly at Margaret. "We'd like Mrs. Sullivan to be our community liaison during filming. She clearly cares deeply about this neighborhood, and that's exactly the kind of person we need to work with." The room went quiet again as everyone turned to look at Margaret. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, not of sadness, but of relief and gratitude. This man, whose day she had completely disrupted, was offering her a second chance. I would be honored," she managed to say, her voice thick with emotion. The next morning, Margaret woke up feeling like a different person. The weight that had been crushing her chest since yesterday's incident had lifted. She looked at herself in the mirror and saw not the rigid rule enforcer she had become, but someone who had been given a second chance. At 9 a.m. sharp, she met with Vin Diesel and the film production team in the community center. The atmosphere was completely different from the tense meeting the night before. Coffee and pastries were laid out, and people were actually smiling. "Mrs. Sullivan," the producer began, "we've drawn up a contract for using Willow Creek Estates as a filming location. We'll be here for 2 weeks, filming various scenes throughout the neighborhood." Margaret listened carefully as they explained the details. The production company would pay the HOA $30,000 per day of filming. They would also hire local residents as extras and use local businesses for catering and supplies. "We'll need to use several homes for interior shots," the location manager explained. "Of course, we'll compensate the homeowners generously." Vin Diesel leaned forward. "And here's something special. We want to feature the community center in a key scene. It's perfect for what we need." Margaret couldn't help but smile. "What about parking? Where will all your vehicles and equipment go?" The producer grinned. "That's where you come in. As our community liaison, you'll help us create a parking plan that works for everyone. No more towing incidents." Over the next few days, Margaret threw herself into her new role. She worked with the film crew to designate parking areas, set up filming schedules that wouldn't disrupt residents' daily routines, and even helped choose which houses would be used for filming. The transformation in the community was remarkable. Residents who had been angry at Margaret now saw her in a new light. She was bringing Hollywood to their doorstep, turning a disaster into an opportunity. Mrs. Thompson, who had tried to warn Margaret about the film crew, became her biggest supporter. "I knew you'd figure it out," she said, patting Margaret's arm. The day filming began, Willow Creek Estates buzzed with excitement. Residents gathered to watch as cameras rolled and Vin Diesel performed his scenes. Margaret stood nearby with a walkie-talkie, coordinating between the film crew and the community. During a break in filming, Vin Diesel approached her. "You know, Mrs. Sullivan, you're a natural at this. Have you ever thought about working in film production?" Margaret laughed. "At my age? I think I'll stick to running the HOA. But thank you for everything. You've taught me a valuable lesson about jumping to conclusions." "We all make mistakes," he replied. "It's how we handle them that matters." The 2 weeks of filming flew by. The production company was true to their word, paying the HOA promptly and treating the community with respect. Several residents got to appear as extras in the film, creating memories they would cherish forever. On the last day of filming, the production team threw a wrap party for the entire community. There was food, music, and a special screening of some rough footage. Margaret watched in amazement as her neighborhood appeared on the big screen. Vin Diesel took the microphone. "I want to thank everyone at Willow Creek Estates for your hospitality, and especially Margaret Sullivan, who turned what could have been a legal battle into a beautiful partnership." The crowd applauded, and Margaret felt tears in her eyes again. She stood up and addressed her neighbors. "I want to apologize again for my hasty actions. This experience has taught me that while rules are important, understanding and communication are even more crucial. From now on, I promise to listen first and act second." As the party continued, Margaret realized that her mistake had led to something wonderful. Their quiet community had experienced something extraordinary, and she had learned to balance her dedication to rules with compassion and common sense. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes can lead to the most unexpected blessings. 6 months had passed since the infamous towing incident, and Willow Creek Estates was a different place. Margaret Sullivan was still the HOA president, but she was no longer the same person who would tow a car without asking questions. The changes were evident in everything she did. Her morning patrols now included friendly chats with residents instead of just looking for violations. She carried her phone not just to call towing companies, but to take pictures of the beautiful gardens and share them on the community's new social media page. "Good morning, Mrs. Sullivan," called out Mr. Rodriguez as she passed his house. "Did you see the newspaper? They mentioned our community in the entertainment section." Margaret smiled and walked over. It was true. Ever since the filming of Fast and Furious 11, Willow Creek Estates had become somewhat famous. The movie had been released last month, and their community appeared in several scenes. The premiere had even included a special thank you to Margaret Sullivan and the residents of Willow Creek Estates. The HOA meetings were different too. Instead of residents complaining about strict rules, they now discussed community events and improvements funded by the movie money. They had renovated the playground, added security cameras, and even started a scholarship fund for local students. Margaret had implemented what she called the Vin Diesel rule. Before taking any enforcement action, she would verify the situation and try to contact the person involved. The new towing policy required photo documentation and a 24-hour warning period except in emergency situations. One sunny afternoon, Margaret noticed an unfamiliar RV parked in the visitor area. In the old days, she would have immediately called for a tow. Now, she approached it with curiosity rather than suspicion. A family was unloading camping gear. "Excuse me," Margaret said kindly. "Are you visiting someone in our community?" The father looked nervous. "Yes, we're here to see my sister in Unit 15C. Is there a problem?" "Not at all," Margaret replied with a warm smile. "I just wanted to welcome you to Willow Creek Estates. Let me get you a visitor pass, and if you need to stay longer than 48 hours, just let me know." The man's relief was visible. "Thank you so much. We've heard wonderful things about this community." Later that week, the HOA held its annual meeting. The community center was packed, but this time with eager residents rather than angry ones. On the wall hung a large framed photograph, Margaret and Vin Diesel shaking hands, with the famous black Charger in the background. "Before we begin," Margaret announced, "I'd like to share some news. The production company has contacted us about using our community for another film next year." Cheers erupted from the crowd. The filming had not only brought money, but also a sense of pride and excitement to their once quiet neighborhood. Tony, Vin Diesel's cousin, stood up. "I'd like to thank Margaret for everything she's done. My cousin still talks about how impressed he was with how she handled everything. He says she's the most dedicated community leader he's ever met." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. "Thank you, Tony. I've learned that dedication means more than just enforcing rules. It means creating a community where everyone feels welcome and valued." As the meeting continued, Margaret reflected on her journey. The towing incident had been the most embarrassing moment of her life, but it had also been the catalyst for positive change. She had learned that flexibility and understanding were just as important as order and regulations. The story of the HOA president who towed Vin Diesel's police car became legendary in community association circles. Margaret was even invited to speak at national conferences about the importance of balanced leadership. As she looked around at her neighbors, now friends rather than just residents to monitor, Margaret knew that sometimes our biggest mistakes can lead to our greatest growth. Willow Creek Estates hadn't just survived the incident, it had thrived because of it. And Margaret Sullivan had become not just a better HOA president, but a better person.